From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Betsy Peterson. I'm the director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you today to the latest in our ongoing lecture series, the Benjamin Botkin Lecture Series. And I just want to note for the record and for posterity that I'm speaking to a beyond standing room only audience, which is terrific. The Botkin series. The Botkin series allows us to highlight current scholarship from distinguished scholars in ethnomusicology, folklore, oral history, cultural heritage studies, and other related fields. It also, for the American Folklife Center, allows us to accomplish a couple of other things. And one important thing is that it feeds into our acquisitions. We record all of these lectures so that later on the website and generations later, folks can hear this lecture today. So with that said, if you have any electronics turned on, please turn them off at this point. I would appreciate it. Today I have the honor of introducing a very distinguished ethnomusicologist, folklorist, and musician, Jeff Todd Titon. Professor Titon received his BA from Amherst College and his MA in English and PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota, where he studied ethnomusicology with Alan Kagan. He's done extensive field work on religious folk music, blues, and old-time fiddling, and he's the author or editor of numerous books, including Early Down-Home Blues, for which he was awarded the prestigious ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, Worlds of Music, a classic ethnomusicology textbook that has gone through 5 printings since it first appeared in 1984, Powerhouse for God, a book, a record, and a documentary film, Old-Time Kentucky Fiddle Tunes, and American Musical Traditions. In addition to all of this writing and publishing, Jeff also served as the editor of Ethnomusicology, the journal for the Society of Ethnomusicology during the 1990s. His teaching career began at Tufts University, and he later went to Brown University, where he was a professor for roughly almost 20 years, not quite, and he's been a visiting professor at numerous colleges, including, I know, Indiana University, my alma mater, Carleton College, Amherst, and Berea College. He's also a fellow of the American Folklore Society and was recently elected to the board of the American Folklore Society. His current projects include fieldwork with Old Regular Baptists in Eastern Kentucky, with whom he's already produced 2 CDs for Smithsonian Folkways. He is developing a website on the life and preaching of the Reverend C.L. Franklin, father of Aretha Franklin. He has a fabulous blog on music, sound, and sustainability, which I encourage you to go and look at. Maybe he'll give you the URL. At any rate, as you can imagine, I could go on, and so I think I'll stop right here. I'd just like to add that Jeff has also recently donated some of his collections to the American Folklife Center, which we're very pleased about, and I want to encourage you to come and use that material. So without further ado, then, I will just simply turn this over to Professor Jeff Todd Titon.
Thanks, Betsy. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Is this all right? Up?
No.
It's good? Okay. It's a little overwhelming to see all of you out here. I hope I have something that might interest you, I'm sure. I have something to say that will at some point, I hope. This is a talk about applied ethnomusicology, what it is and why they said such terrible things about it. It's not a very original title, I apologize for that, but I thought it might be of interest. At least some people wonder what the terrible things are. They include such things as irrelevance and imperialism and political interference, let's see, a good phrase was manipulating the destinies of people. Another one was spying. So we'll get to those in a little while. I want to begin this with a confrontation that took place in the winter of 1939, an encounter between Alan Lomax, who I'm sure is well known to all of you, and somebody who may not be so well known, George Herzog. Lomax had moved to New York temporarily in 1939 with the permission of his employer, then the Library of Congress, to take courses in music and anthropology at Columbia. At that time, Herzog was a Columbia professor of anthropology and also the most powerful figure in comparative musicology, which was one of the ancestors of ethnomusicology. No doubt, Lomax told Herzog who he was and why he wanted to take his course in folk music as a special student. But Herzog refused to let him in because Lomax hadn't taken the prerequisite course that he offered in primitive music. And those of you who knew Alan can only imagine the scene. Herzog had a terrible temper, and Alan wrote back to his supervisor, Harold Spivak, at the Library of Congress, and he said, quote, "I met a very much surprised Dr. Herzog at Columbia this morning, a Dr. Herzog who told me that I had made a great mistake in coming to school to take his course this term, that I should have come next term, should have come next year, and for a whole year. Such a neurotic little academic man you never saw before." So he never took the course. And I take this confrontation between Lomax and Herzog to foreshadow the problems of applied work that applied work would have within ethnomusicology, at least in the early years, and why ethnomusicologists might say such terrible things about it. In 1939, when their confrontation took place, of course, the field of ethnomusicology didn't yet exist. The word wasn't even coined until 1950, and the Society for Ethnomusicology wasn't established until 1955. But if anybody was doing ethnomusicology in America in 1939, it was George Herzog. And as both Daniel Sheehy and Anthony Seeger have pointed out, Alan Lomax was doing applied ethnomusicology before it got its name either. So between its naming in 1950 and the death of Alan Merriam in 1980, ethnomusicology often was described as a marriage of comparative musicology with cultural anthropology. During that same period, applied anthropology was one of anthropology's emergent and exciting growth areas. We would expect that an applied ethnomusicology would have emerged then and grown as well, but that did not happen until the 1980s, and instead, ethnomusicologists said terrible things about it. Why they did so, and why applied ethnomusicology wasn't accepted until the 1980s, is one of my subjects this morning, or this noon, I guess it is. The other, of course, is what is applied ethnomusicology, and what do applied ethnomusicologists actually do? And of course, I'll give you my take on it. There are different opinions, of course, on what it is and what we do. But at any rate, it's important to know that today applied ethnomusicology is well established as one of the strongest branches of academic ethnomusicology. Among the sections of the Society for Ethnomusicology, the applied section is the third largest in membership. Only the student section and the popular music section are larger. Herzog would have been rolling in his grave at that. And so before getting to that history and some of the terrible things and what happened to turn things around, I want to propose a definition of applied ethnomusicology and offer some examples of what applied ethnomusicologists do. Many of you here will be familiar with this, and some of you practice applied ethnomusicology. There's a lot of information here, much of it never before presented to the public, and that's why I'm relying on my notes. I want to do what I can to get it right for you. I like to think of ethnomusicology as the study of people making music. Applied ethnomusicology puts the study of people making music to practical use. Now that's a very broad definition. More specifically, as it's developed in North America and elsewhere, applied ethnomusicology is a music-centered intervention into a particular community whose purpose is to benefit that community. For example, a social improvement, a musical benefit, a cultural good, or an economic advantage. It's music-centered, but above all, the intervention is people-centered. For the understanding that drives it towards reciprocity is based in collaborative partnerships that arise from ethnomusicological fieldwork. Applied ethnomusicology is guided by ethical principles of social responsibility, human rights, cultural and musical equity, and justice. Although some ethnomusicologists regard applied ethnomusicology as a career alternative to academic work, I don't think it's helpful to make that distinction. Because ethnomusicologists who do applied work are employed both inside and outside of academic institutions. In other words, the place of employment doesn't determine whether the study of people making music has any application outside of the world of scholarship. What matters is the work itself, how, where, and why the intervention occurs, and the communities to whom we feel responsible. What kinds of activities are applied ethnomusicologists involved in? Where typically do we intervene in the public sphere? Applied ethnomusicology is practiced internationally, but because I'm most familiar with activities in the United States and the professional organization based here, that is the Society for Ethnomusicology, or SEM, as I'll sometimes call it, I'll concentrate on US-based applied ethnomusicology. First, like public folklorists, we're involved in promoting music, dance, and other cultural expressions in order to benefit artists and communities. Whether undertaken by ethnomusicologists acting primarily on their own behalf, or whether supported by cultural organizations, these cultural policy interventions are among the oldest types of applied ethnomusicology and remain one of the most common. Lately, sustainability has become the generally accepted policy goal. At the moment, I'm trying to push cultural sustainability in the direction of cultural resilience, but that is a story for another time. Examples of these policy interventions include working with and for granting agencies that promote the arts, and with organizations devoted to expanding the creative economy through musical heritage and cultural tourism, sometimes with a view to recovering from disasters such as hurricanes, urban blight, and mountaintop removal. In the 21st century, as most of you know very well, UNESCO has become the major international force in cultural policy, with its treaties encouraging the preservation of what it calls intangible cultural heritage. The U.S. has not signed these treaties, but because our work takes us all over the world, many U.S.-based ethnomusicologists are involved with UNESCO activities anyway. Ethnomusicologists have worked as consultants, as arts administrators, ethnographic field workers, festival presenters, radio and television producers, podcasters and internet site developers, educators, facilitators, mediators, writers, expert witnesses, and in various other capacities formulating and administering cultural policies whose purpose is cultural, economic, and musical benefit as informed by social responsibility and justice. Another area of practice for applied ethnomusicologists is advocacy, either on behalf of particular music makers or a music community as a whole. Rather than adopt the role of objective observer gathering information, the applied ethnomusicologist assumes the role of a partisan, working in partnership towards goals that are mutually understood and agreed on. Seldom has partnership worked when the ethnomusicologist plays the role of the expert and imposes solutions to problems perceived from a distance. Advocacy includes grant writing on behalf of individuals and communities, writing promotional and press materials, acting as an agent to arrange performances, facilitating community self-documentation initiatives, repatriation of recordings and musical artifacts from museums and archives, political lobbying for arts spaces, facilitating community arts education projects, researching the history of musical traditions for the community, acting as an intermediary between cultural insiders and outsiders, and long-term planning for the sustainability of music cultures. A third area that applied ethnomusicologists are involved with is education. Often educators ourselves, applied ethnomusicologists work with other educators designing curricula and to bring musicians into the schools and community centers to demonstrate, to teach, and to perform. They also facilitate visits to performance spaces where people may observe and sometimes participate in music-making activities. Like folklorists, ethnomusicologists have been active in fostering interest in local musical artists and traditions, particularly from newly arrived cultural and ethnic groups. Other areas of contemporary practice include peace and conflict resolution, medicine, law and the music industry, libraries, museums and sound archives, journalism, and environmental sound activism and eco-justice. Peace-related applications are more frequent outside of North America, as among refugee populations and in conflict regions such as the Balkans and the Middle East, while music has been an important part of labor and civil rights movements in the United States since the 19th century, and probably before. Among the projects of medical ethnomusicology are HIV/AIDS work in Africa, therapeutic work with post-traumatic stress survivors, and music within autism communities. Legal applications have involved music copyright infringement cases and work on intellectual property issues, as the question who owns culture becomes increasingly important when large sums of money are at stake. Applied ethnomusicologists are involved in political action opposing sound pollution, such as noise from ocean vessels and military activities that affect whales, dolphins, and other sea creatures. We are contributing to the new discipline of ecomusicology, which is the study of music, sound, culture, and nature in a time of environmental crisis. Journalists educated in ethnomusicology bring to world music a broadly informed historical and geographical perspective. We've written for newspapers, magazines, and online publications. Ethnomusicologists working in the music industry serve as consultants, ethnographers, technical assistants, and producers. Many libraries, museums, universities, and other institutions maintain sound archives where archivists with ethnomusicological training offer expertise in acquisition, cataloging, grant writing, preservation, and outreach. Applied ethnomusicologists also are gradually producing a body of theoretical and critical literature. In 1992, a special issue of Ethnomusicology, the Journal of the Society for Ethnomusicology, was devoted to ethnomusicology in the public interest. It featured essays by Daniel Sheehy, Bess Lomax Hawes, Martha Ellen Davis, and Anthony Seeger. In my own essay in that special issue, I wrote that ethnomusicology in the public interest, quote, is work whose immediate end is not research on the flow of knowledge inside intellectual communities, but rather practical action in the world outside of archives and universities, unquote, and that, quote, as a way of knowing and doing, fieldwork, which is constitutive of ethnomusicology, at its best, is based on friendship rather than observation of objects. Bess Hawes was invited to give the Seeger Lecture at the 1993 SEM conference, and this autobiographical talk, meant in part to attract listeners to applied ethnomusicology and public folklore as a calling, was published 2 years later in the journal Ethnomusicology. An international conference on applied ethnomusicology took place at my university, Brown, in 2003, the same year that a special issue of Folklore Forum devoted to applied ethnomusicology was published. A book of essays entitled Applied Ethnomusicology, Historical and Contemporary Approaches appeared in 2010, and the Oxford Handbook of Applied Ethnomusicology is scheduled for publication in the summer of 2015. Let me give you an example of applied ethnomusicology because I know my own work best. Please indulge me as I show you something from my own work. I hope it's not too immodest to do so. In 1990, as a visiting professor at Berea College in Kentucky, I spent my weekends with old regular Baptists in the southeastern part of the state, in the middle of coal mining country. And after several months of getting to know them and they me, the head of their association, Elwood Cornett, asked me if I could help them conserve their singing tradition, lined out hymnody, which is the oldest style and repertoire of English language religious music in oral tradition in the United States. It is a very, very complicated and difficult way of singing. Each singer elaborates the melody in their own way, and they don't have a conductor, they don't have musical notation, and the music doesn't have a pulse beat. One person sings a line, and then the rest join in and repeat the line to an even more elaborate melody, in step but out of phase. Here, I want to show you a little video clip of their singing so you have an idea of what it's like. And to do that, I have to get out of here. This is a song. This is a song called "Bold Soldiers." This is from a baptism, and it's from video footage that I shot in 1990.
Bold soldiers.
Not so. And horse, but I
Bold soldiers on you I call, although we are but few. Although we are but few, when you've done all, stand fast and keep. When you've done all, stand fast and keep the glorious prize in view. The glorious prize in view.
That's an example of their singing. Women sing too. It just happened that in this example it was only men, but women sing too. Elwood Cornett, their association leaders, told me that the elders had tried to teach the younger ones some years earlier, but in this culture where modesty is palpable, the face-to-face instruction put too much pressure on the youngsters, and the education failed. And he wondered whether I might have, some ideas that might help. And we talked about it, and I noticed that some of the church members were bringing cheap boom boxes to church to record the services, the singing and preaching, especially for friends and relatives who were sick and couldn't come to church. So I suggested that we try to make good quality recordings so that the younger people might learn these songs by singing along in the privacy of their homes, or even better, in their automobiles. So Elwood agreed, and I got them a grant from NEA Folk Arts Division. This was in the early 1990s. And I taught them how to make good recordings of their music, and we made some together. And then they made a lot more and circulated cassettes for the younger people to learn from. And then Smithsonian Folkways released a couple of albums of their singing. Tony Seeger, on hearing this music, said he felt like he was surrounded by a room full of Roscoe Holcombs. Anyway, and now the singing tradition is on firm ground. And here's what Elwood Cornett said about it in an interview with Appleshop that was broadcast over the Appleshop, Kentucky radio station a few years ago.
It would appear to me that this way of singing is probably much more accepted right now than it was a few years ago, and I think the interest of Jeff Titon and Willie Ruff and some others that used to be at Berea, Bill Talmadge and so forth, has made a lot of difference in that. And then our people have begun to say, hey, we've got something here pretty special. And I think you know already that the Smithsonian recorded a couple of CDs of our singing, and all of that has caused our people to say, hey, we want to hang on to this way of singing.
We couldn't have done it without many of the people and organizations represented in this room. So, congratulate yourselves as well. Successful project. I turn now to applied ethnomusicology and the terrible things that were said. What you've all been waiting for. The histories of ethnomusicology taught in most doctoral programs trace its roots to comparative musicology, defined by Guido Adler in 1885 as a division of musicology, which involved the comparison of musical works of the various peoples of the earth, these are his words, for ethnographical purposes, and the classification of them according to their various forms. Comparative musicology arrived in the United States in the person of none other than Alan Lomax's nemesis, George Herzog, in 1925. Herzog studied anthropology with Franz Boas at Columbia, and this is an art picture of Boas. Isn't that striking? He studied with Boas, Herzog did, and he received the PhD in 1928 from Boas in Columbia. Herzog pursued an academic career as a professor at Yale, Columbia, and Indiana universities, one that lasted until he went insane in the mid-1950s. He was recognized during this period as the leading American authority on indigenous music. He was also one of the leading authorities on folk music, which is why Alan wanted to take his course. Among his students were two of the founders of the Society for Ethnomusicology, David McAllister and Willard Rhodes. Herzog's writings exhibited an empirical scientific method which required musical transcriptions and analysis. His methods added Boas-styled ethnographic research to the comparative musical analysis that often characterized the work of the Germans. A Dutch comparative musicologist, Jaap Kunst, coined the term ethnomusicology in 1950 and proposed that comparative musicology change its name. His argument didn't rest on the idea of ethno, but rather on eliminating the word comparative. All good science, he argued, is comparative in nature anyway. Disciplines like comparative linguistics and comparative embryology had, after all, dropped those adjectives and just become embryology and linguistics. Why should musicology have it? But then if it was musicology, that wasn't quite right either, so he added the ethno prefix. His argument was persuasive, and many comparative musicologists began to call themselves ethnomusicologists, while those of a more cultural persuasion saw a chance to elevate the cultural study of music in the new field with the new name. The founding of the Society for Ethnomusicology in 1955 might have moved applied ethnomusicology to a more central position. As Bruno Nettel observed, quote, "The beginning of the SEM was deeply rooted in the anthropological background of its most influential leaders," unquote. Most prominent among them were Alan Merriam and David McAllister, both among the four founders of SEM. Herzog was noticeably absent from SEM's founding, and it's worth asking why. Nettel attributed his absence to his growing mental problems, and no doubt that was so. But the founders also certainly wanted to escape Herzog's dominance. McAllister reported that as far as he knew, he, McAllister, was the only student ever to finish the doctorate under Herzog's supervision. Herzog had a habit of losing his students' papers, never grading or returning them. And McAllister came to my seminar in the history of ethnomusicological thought, which I taught at Brown for 27 years. McAllister came in 1989 and talked about the history of the founding of SEM and his career and everything and so on. And I'm going to draw on some of the things he said for this. Quote, "The campus was littered with the bodies of failed Herzog students," McAllister told my seminar. Herzog's habit, McAllister said, was to demonstrate to them time after time that they could not meet his standards. Quote, "He never failed them in so many words, but they had a very hard time ever getting an appointment with him. And when they finally did, it was all at such a high level that they felt sort of defeated. If they brought in a transcription, it was so bad that he went over it note by note to show them and said, 'Now see if you can't, now that you've had this practice, do better next time.' And then a month or so later, when they finally caught up with him again, then the same thing would happen again." Herzog was Nettel's dissertation supervisor at Indiana, but before Nettel could complete his doctorate, Herzog's erratic behavior forced Nettel to move to a different supervisor. McAllister commented, quote, "Nettel left Herzog, but most of us couldn't do that. We were with Herzog, and it was do or die, and many died. One of those who died was Willard Rhodes, one of the founders of the society. Herzog would never approve his work, and so it's no wonder really that Herzog was not involved in with these founders. But that must be only part of the answer. In his memoirs, Nettle, reminiscing about this early period, recalls that he and others, he thinks, regarded these events more as a revival of comparative musicology, which had been all but eliminated in Europe during the Nazi era, than as a revolution that brought about something new, ethnomusicology. As a comparative musicologist himself, Nettle's bias toward comparative musicology is understandable. However, he was not one of the founders. This is Nettle. This is Bruno Nettle. And here's kind of a silly picture of the four founders. It's you can see left to right there Charles Seeger, Alan Merriam, Willard Rhodes, and Dave McAllister. And I asked them all about this founding. I had conversations with all of them, so some of this is based on what they said, McAllister in particular. Nettle was still a graduate student when the Society for Ethnomusicology was founded. He was not involved in the conversations with McAllister, Merriam, Rhodes, and Seeger as they planned and then established the new organization. So let me try to reconstruct something of its significance as I believe it to have appeared to the founders at the time. And as I said, in so doing, I rely on my conversations with Rhodes, Merriam, and Seeger, and especially McAllister about this period. McAllister recalled that after Herzog was finally confined to a mental institution, he could no longer exercise his former control over degrees, grants, and publications in comparative musicology. Quote, he became so ill that he had to be in an institution, and then the lid was off, and the society could be established, McAllister said. For the four founders, SEM must have represented a move away from comparative musicology, not just an escape from Herzog's iron grip, but also establishing a field more welcoming to the cultural study of music. The founders resisted efforts from other societies who tried to dissuade them from starting a new society, including the American Musicological Society and the International Folk Music Council. McAllister reported that, quote, Maud Karpeles came, or is it Karpeles? Karpeles, thank you, came and pleaded with us to become a wing of the International Folk Music Council. Alan Merriam particularly, well, Charlie Seeger too, they were both very insistent that it not get into the hands of the International Folk Music Council. Merriam thought they were just a bunch of singers and dancers, you know. But yeah, really. So when this is McAllister talking here. So when we started the society, the IFMC, got wind of it, and they were very upset because they had their American branch, and they were afraid we would simply split their society and draw membership away from them. There were scholars among them, great scholars among them, but they were not anthropologically oriented, and it just happened by the way we operated that the Society for Ethnomusicology began with an anthropological orientation. For Alan Merriam, even more than for McAllister, ethnomusicology would become the anthropology of music rather than comparative musicology. He lobbied hard for the study of music as culture, not merely in culture. And that's a viewpoint that most contemporary ethnomusicologists have assimilated. Obtaining a full professorship in anthropology at Indiana University in 1962, Merriam was not only a founder, but a forceful presence in SEM from the very beginning until his untimely death in an airplane crash in 19... He's still a forceful presence. Nettle is still fighting with him. For Nettle, ethnomusicology was a subfield of musicology. For Merriam and McAllister, ethnomusicology was a subfield of anthropology. As I said, one would expect that the anthropologists who led SEM would have encouraged and applied ethnomusicology. Anthropologists had by then started putting their knowledge to work in solving social problems. John Van Willigen, a historian of applied anthropology, dates the rise of a socially committed applied or action anthropology to 1945. But this exciting, albeit controversial development in anthropology did not cross over into SEM with any success until decades later. The reasons, in retrospect, are not surprising. To establish ethnomusicology within the most secure of institutional bases, that is, within universities, it was necessary to position ethnomusicology as a research science. Musicological and anthropological ethnomusicologists might disagree over the emphasis of the discipline, but they agreed that scholarship and the production of knowledge was its goal. Applications of that research in the public arena might be well and good, but the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake had always been valued most highly in university settings where it could be protected from outside forces. In 1950, ethnomusicology itself was a fringe discipline within the United States, with only a few courses being offered and only a few professors available to advise doctoral dissertations. For ethnomusicology to expand, professors must succeed in establishing more faculty lines. Eventually, every music department, every music school or conservatory, and every anthropology department would have at least one ethnomusicologist doing research and offering music courses with a worldwide scope. And some would have more than one, and establish graduate programs training future generations of ethnomusicologists as the discipline would expand. Second, for ethnomusicology to become institutionalized, it had to be regarded as a professional vocation, not as an amateur pursuit. Cultural anthropologists and comparative musicologists had always distinguished between themselves as professional scientists and the amateurs who traveled the world and collected information in the field but were not properly trained to analyze it. Besides, these amateurs exhibited a dangerous tendency to write popular books, to present illustrated lectures in public libraries, and to catch the attention of the media. Only by continuing this gatekeeping could ethnomusicologists keep their jobs and profession secure within the university world. I believe that a third reason was the distrust among this generation of scholars who came of age during or soon after World War II of social engineering. Applied research put to practical use in musical or cultural interventions, despite intended benefits, was suspect, particularly given the political uses to which music and art generally have been put in the Nazi and Soviet spheres. Most important, many in the previous generation of United States music scholars had been born in Europe and fled to the New World to escape persecution and establish a musical scholarship inside the university world where they could be free from political interference. This third reason was never directly articulated, but it can be inferred from the cautionary language that they used when they deigned to talk about applied ethnomusicology, as we shall soon see. The term applied ethnomusicology did not appear in an SEM publication until 1963. Alan Merriam was the first U.S. ethnomusicologist to recognize an applied ethnomusicology by that name. In his book, The Anthropology of Music, published in 1964, he wrote that, quote, "The ultimate aim of the study of man involves the question of whether one is searching for knowledge for its own sake or is attempting to provide solutions for practical applied problems. Ethnomusicology has seldom been used in the same manner as applied or action anthropology, and ethnomusicologists have only rarely felt called upon to help solve problems in manipulating the destinies of people. And in those circumstances, it's also difficult to avoid outside control over the research project. Merriam's worry over outside control is a worry over outside threats to academic freedom, and his sardonic phrase, manipulating the destinies of people, voices his distrust of social engineering and his opposition to political and cultural interventions. Bruno Nettel was born to a Jewish family in Czechoslovakia in 1930. In 1939, to escape Nazism, he and his family emigrated to the United States. His father, Paul, was a famous musicologist who taught at Indiana University. Far more than anyone else, Nettel has shouldered the burden of writing the history of ethnomusicology, and almost single-handedly has done so for the past 60 years. Generation after generation of graduate students have absorbed his histories. He seldom mentions applied ethnomusicology, but when he does, he says terrible things about it. In his most important textbook, The Study of Ethnomusicology, published in 1983 and revised in 2005, he writes this. This is the same language in both editions, 1983 and 2005. Quote, "In the course of the 1950s, there developed a concept and a subdiscipline, applied anthropology, whose task it was to use anthropological insight to help solve social problems, particularly those occasioned by rapid culture change in the wake of modernization and westernization." I believe that Nettle gets it exactly wrong here. Applied anthropologists were enlisted then to help solve problems such as third world poverty. The solutions attempted, as they advised U.S. government organizations such as AID, were agricultural modernization and economic development. And the unfortunate result often was rapid social change and cultural upheaval. No wonder then, as Nettle continues, although, quote, "anthropologists wanted to help, they frequently ended up offending the local population and doing what was perceived as harmful. As a result, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were widely attacked for doing work of no relevance to social problems, of mixing in local politics, of spying. Ethnomusicologists shared in this criticism," unquote. Nettle has somehow mapped applied ethnomusicologists' efforts to conserve traditional music and culture onto applied anthropologists' efforts to overturn traditional culture. Compounding this error, he means to suggest that applied ethnomusicologists were offensive, harmful, and irrelevant, and that they barged into local politics and were accused of being spies. These are terrible things to say, but if they were true about applied anthropologists for one kind of intervention, they could not be true about applied ethnomusicologists for the opposite, unless Nettle means that any kind of intervention was resented. Eventually, Nettle admits that, quote, "the picture is not entirely negative. Some societies are happy to have outsiders come, appreciate their efforts, their respect for the traditions, and their help in restoring vigor to rapidly disappearing musics. Even so, there is often the feeling that the members of the society itself, given the right training, equipment, and time, could do it better," unquote. To his credit, Nettle recognizes the potential good that can arise from a collaborative applied ethnomusicology. Yet his unease with applied work is obvious. To be fair, Nettle may be changing his mind late in his life. He's now in his mid-80s. And in a recent lecture, he acknowledged the appeal of applied ethnomusicology to a new generation of ethnomusicologists. Those in ethnomusicology's founding generation who did some applied work, Mantle Hood and David McAllister, for example, did so without calling attention to it as such, and they probably didn't even consider it in that light. They simply did it out of a sense of ethics and reciprocity. And ethnomusicology gradually did become established in the college and university world. Yet, ironically, it was not by positioning ethnomusicology as a research science. Rather, beginning in the late 1960s, ethnomusicology benefited from a combination of external circumstances that the founding generation did not foresee. The most important of these were, first, the sudden craze for world music, available as never before on LP records and in concerts by Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan and others. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that. Master musicians from Ghana, North and South India, the Arab world, China, Japan, and Indonesia soon were in residence as world music performance ensemble directors at American colleges and universities, where ethnomusicologists were already teaching. Enrollments in world music courses grew exponentially. Secondly, America was moving its cultural narrative away from the universal melting pot and towards ethnic roots, pride, and cultural pluralism. In education, this opened the humanities curriculum to a variety of international and minority subjects and voices. Music schools that saw the handwriting on the wall began to hire ethnomusicologists. By 1977, it was possible to obtain the doctorate by studying ethnomusicology with Nazir Jirazboy at UCLA, Frederick Lieberman at Brown, George List and Alan Merriam at Indiana, Bruno Nettle at Illinois, Robert Garfias at Washington, Alan Kagan, my teacher, at Minnesota, William Malm at Michigan, and David McAllister at Wesleyan Universities, among others. Today, most top and second-tier colleges and universities have at least one ethnomusicologist on their faculty, and usually in the music department or music school. In the 1980s, the Society for Ethnomusicology, though, remained chiefly a research community of professors and graduate students. It was not until most of the founding generation aged and gradually relinquished leadership that applied ethnomusicology was able to enter SEM in an institutional way. But it was not merely a changing of the generations. Another significant change within academia resulted from the growth of cultural studies and critical theory. The result, particularly among those attracted to the study of music as culture, was a turn in ethnomusicology from science toward cultural critique, from the musical object to the musical experience, from analysis to interpretation, and from explanation to understanding. By the end of the 1980s, ethnomusicology had assimilated the interpretive cultural anthropology of Clifford Geertz, Dennis Tedlock, James Clifford, George Marcus, and others, a far cry from the empirical anthropology Herzog had championed, or the sciencing about music that Merriam had propounded. Ethnomusicology's turn away from science and toward the humanities led a growing number of North American ethnomusicologists to applied ethnomusicology in one form or another, advocating on behalf of individual musicians, musical communities, and musical life in particular places. The new fieldwork had become experience-centered. 1970s ethnomusicological monographs, such as those by Paul Berliner, the Soul of Mbira, and Charles Kyle, Tiv Music, were in the vanguard of a turn to reflexivity. Kenneth Gourlay's 1982 essay in the SEM Journal, Towards a Humanizing Ethnomusicology, offered a theoretical basis for the new direction, along with a strongly worded critique of Merriam's insistence on science. In that same issue of Ethnomusicology, Charles Kyle's essay, Applied Ethnomusicology and a Rebirth of Music from the Spirit of Tragedy, charted a path towards work that, as he said, can make a difference through an insistence on putting music into play wherever people are resisting their oppression. Kyle's radical position allied applied ethnomusicology with decolonization, and in retrospect, I think it's very fortunate that applied ethnomusicology waited to emerge during the period of post-colonial critique, for in so doing, it largely avoided the stigma of applied anthropology's alliances with government-supported modernization and development programs in the Third World. A humanized ethnomusicology thus made it possible for an applied ethnomusicology, manifesting itself not only in a new fieldwork based in reciprocity leading to advocacy, but also through institutional gains within SEM. The growth of applied ethnomusicology in the United States in the 1980s was also greatly aided by the development of public folklore. As administrators and sometimes field workers, a few dozen ethnomusicologists were employed either full or part-time by the Smithsonian Institution, the American Folklife Center, and the Folk Arts Division of the National Endowment for the Arts, whose director, Bess Hawes, held an informal session at the SEM conference every year in the 1980s to inform ethnomusicologists of the opportunities for submitting applied ethnomusicology project proposals to the NEA. I myself served as a presenter at the 1976 Smithsonian Folklife Festival, which Hawes also directed, and on the NEA Folk Arts Division panel from 1989 to 83, and then again a couple more times. I owe a lasting debt of gratitude to Bess Hawes and to her assistant director at the NEA, Dan Sheehy, for helping me understand how I could function as both a research scholar and as an applied ethnomusicologist while employed in the academic world. Applied ethnomusicology went mainstream within SEM during the 1990s. I've already discussed some of the landmark publications of that decade and the next. The Applied Ethnomusicology section of SEM began as a committee in 1998 and became a section in 2002. In 2007, SEM itself went on record with a position statement opposed to the use of music for torture. You may know that music was one of the detainees were tortured. They especially apparently hated Eminem, and we convinced the executive board, who didn't really need convincing, to go on record with a position statement against the use, and so there is a position statement, you can see it on the SEM website, that condemns the use of music for torture. It should condemn torture too, of course, but music in the use. This is a political stand taken by the organization SEM that would have been unthinkable in the 20th century, just absolutely unthinkable. for the organization to do that, and by the way, there were objections from some when it did that. The board said that go ahead, object. Anyway, I don't have time to discuss the many projects that applied ethnomusicologists embarked on beginning in the 1980s, but I would refer you to the growing literature on the subject already published, and especially to the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Applied Ethnomusicology. In fact, this talk is a greatly condensed and somewhat modified version of my part of the introduction to that book, the Oxford Handbook of Applied Ethno. And finally, there are so many folklorists here. I would invite you to think of parallels between, if you haven't already been thinking about them, probably between the histories of applied ethnomusicology and public folklore. Did anybody say terrible things about public folklore? And maybe why and what happened to turn things around? It would be interesting to hear some of the answers. So I'm done, and I tried to time this to leave some time for questions. Did I?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. There aren't any? Yes.
Yes, in defense of Paul Nettle.
Bruno Nettle, you mean?
I'm sorry, Bruno Nettle.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry.
Yeah.
He would have had in the back of his mind the treatment of folk music in Czechoslovakia, which is a long and sad history.
No doubt.
I can understand very well why he would have retreated from that position.
No doubt. The way that the Soviets and the communists in general were using folklore was, part of the problems that generation had seen up close, in his case up close and personal, and so naturally it led to a distrust of social engineering. Absolutely.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. It's really wonderful to hear about this history of applied ethnomusicology. I just have a sort of, I don't know if it's a basic question or not, but I'm curious about the term applied ethnomusicology versus public folklore versus, say, public humanities or public scholarship. And has there been any discussion within the section at SEM about that? I mean, your discussion of Nettle's characterization of the roots of applied ethnomusicology being with applied anthropology makes sense, but you seem to be kind of doubting that. So I wonder, just by sort of what would seem to me a more descriptive title for sort of subdiscipline like public ethnomusicology, so isn't there?
No, it's not absent. In fact, the current president of SEM prefers the term public ethnomusicology, but is not familiar with the history of applied ethnomusicology. It just happens that applied is the established term. In 1992, it was not. When the issue of the SEM journal came out, there were a number of possible terms, including public, applied, action, and others, and I decided that I would title the journal Music in the Public Interest. That was the title of the special issue. When the section, when the Committee on Applied Ethnomusicology was established by SEM in 1997, Doris Diane and Martha Davis, who established it, chose the term applied ethnomusicology. ICTM, the successors of the International Folk Music Council, the International Council on Traditional Music, a UNESCO organization, established a study group on applied ethnomusicology a year or two later, I think in 1998 or so. And so that's the name that's in use now. But I think it's open for discussion, and it may be that public ethnomusicology turns out to be a better term. There are certainly some advantages to it. Emphasizes the work in the public sphere, the problem I see with it is that it also can be confused as a place of employment, and I think that it's very problematic to dichotomize the academic. Obviously, I have a bias here. I think it's very problematic to oppose the academic world and the world outside. I don't think it does good for any either, and so I see that as a problem with the word public. But I think it's certainly open, and these things change too over time, and maybe in 5 or 10 years, public will become the accepted word. I don't know. Yeah, Brent. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on becoming the American Folklore Society board member.
Wonder if I know what I'm in for. You've been on the board now for a couple of years.
We can have lunch. I wanted to just ask you and go back to
Yeah.
talking about trust and associate leader Cornett. That time
Yeah.
we first met
Yeah.
at the Folklife program in Frankfurt. I think you brought some singers
Yeah.
there, and you talked about trust and friendship.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when you start to bring them out of a true community context where you were going in, can you tell us maybe briefly about how that process, when you brought with Bess's coaxing, how you maybe brought them to Washington, but then you started to bring them closer to home, and how that dynamic went?
Well, Elwood Cornett, the head of the association, has always felt that it was important for the old regular Baptists not to be misunderstood by people in universities, colleges, general public, and so on and so forth. The history of misunderstanding there, and he felt that by doing these public things, it might actually help. He, for example, where I first met him was at Berea College in 1979. That's where I first met Loyal Jones. They had a conference on what they called rural hymnody, and Berea invited Elwood and a group of singers to come and demonstrate their music for this conference at Berea. And I thought it was very important to make the distinction between demonstration and performance, and they understood and in fact endorsed the idea that it would be a demonstration and so on. And when we brought them to Frankfurt, or we brought them to the Smithsonian Festival, I had some trepidation. I myself, any of you who've read on my blog, you know that I have grave misgivings about creative economy, cultural tourism, and allying all of this stuff to money. I'm happier in a gift economy, and I think that the old regular Baptists really understand that as well. Music as a gift, of course, that's an old Christian idea, but it's also, I think, important to understand that someone like Elwood is a wise and brilliant person. I can't tell you how, when you've all met some people in these communities who are just, if they were president of the United States or Speaker of the House or something, right? We wouldn't have these problems, or we'd have less of them. And Elwood was one of these people. He's much wiser and smarter than I am and any of us. And he was in favor of doing all of this. And when we went to the Smithsonian, he understood at once what the festival was about. And their demonstrations were just splendid. At the end, he had everybody in the last performance in the big tent. Diana Parker was there, all the James Early, and he had everybody in the audience just listening to every word that he was saying, how he had appreciated what had happened how they all had appreciated what had happened at the festival, and then he did something that I hadn't expected. He had everybody sing Amazing Grace in the new melody. They have an old melody, the different melody for Amazing Grace, but everybody sang Amazing Grace. And it's their habit to go around shaking hands and hugging each other at in their services. So they did that. Everybody did that. Diana Parker was in tears over all of this. So he understood that. He understands this better, than most people do. He should be the anyway. So just fortunate to be able to meet somebody like this.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks again for a great talk. It's so instructive to get more dimension about the history of the disciplines that we adhere to understand the dynamics of the relationships, and to be able to take the time here with you to kind of look back. One of the questions that I have, I guess still somewhat applies to myself, but I also know a number of people in the room that are coming to the discipline of ethnomusicology or folklore or cultural anthropology. How much of the history of these disciplines do they need to pick up the baggage in order to move forward with the work that they want to do, with the communities that they want to engage with? I mean, how flexible are these disciplines in terms of the collaborative possibilities? If they're trying to find their own identities within the discipline, building careers and connections.
I think it's as you're suggesting. I think it's very important for everybody to construct their own narrative of themselves in working in the area wherever they're working. There's a tendency, I think, for younger people to be somewhat rebellious and see themselves as doing something original or something different or something in opposition and so on. And then finally you realize that, well, this is your family, and you kind of need to figure out where you stand within this particular context. I think that happens when you get older. But at any rate, it does seem to me that different generations are going to write different histories. The founding generation of ethnomusicology clearly had very little use for applied ethnomusicology or public ethnomusicology. The contemporary generation needs to write a different history, and some of us are trying, but I'm an old guy now, so the younger people need to write about that too. There needs to be more written by younger people about public folklore, certainly. It's very important to do that. And the narrative that I gave you was kind of a struggle and triumph narrative, right? You've recognized this kind of thing, there are other kinds of formulas that we could put all of this into as well. It needn't be quite like that, and it's always in process and progress. So, but I think the important thing is to locate oneself in an ongoing stream eventually, rather than to say that I'm different. You maybe, if you're really different, you wind up like the people on Solaris. Some of you saw that science fiction movie, very alone and isolated.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.